Hi, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you might be joining from. But thank you for joining us today and taking the time to be here. My name is Kayla Ripple, and I'm a principal associate with the LenFest Ocean Program. And for those of you that may not know us very well, the LenFest Ocean Program is a grant-making program. We fund ocean and coastal research projects to address the needs that face decision makers and stakeholders. You can learn more about us and the projects we fund at lenfestocean.org. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter. If you're on Twitter, be sure to follow us at lenfestocean. In fact, we'll be live tweeting this webinar today using the hashtag LOPwebinar. So feel free to use it too if you'd like to engage with us there. Today is the fifth webinar in a series that highlights projects from our Climate Resilient Fisheries grant portfolio. In this portfolio, we're supporting projects where scientists are working with managers and stakeholders all over the US and abroad to better understand how climate change will impact fisheries and therefore help fisheries managers and communities develop solutions to foster climate-ready fisheries. This includes a range of topics such as predicting range shifts of economically important fish stocks, understanding the climate vulnerability of communities, and providing guidance on adaptive management for fisheries, among other things. If you're interested to learn more about these projects, I'll drop a link in the chat soon. Here you can also view and sign up for upcoming webinars that are in this series. We'll be taking a summer break, but the series will start up again in September. Our next webinar will be on Monday, September 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, all about understanding climate impacts on stock assessments in the US. And I'll drop a link for that in the chat as well. But today we're excited to have joining us Dr. Yunzhou Li and Dr. Yong Chen with Stony Brook University. Their project is focused on understanding the socio-ecological vulnerability of China's marine fisheries under climate change. And this is especially important as China is a major producer and exporter of seafood products globally. So there's obviously a lot of implications and things to learn, not only around the ecological impact of climate change, but also the overlapping social and economic impacts it could have. I'll drop a link to their project page again once I finish my introduction. But there are currently 2 papers out from this team and 1 in progress, and we're very excited to have them dive into the details of their results in this webinar today. Now, before we get started, just a few logistical things. To prevent any feedback or echoes, all attendees are muted, but we do want to hear from you. So please feel free to drop your comments or other resources you think would be useful to share with others in the chat box during the webinar. And if you have questions for the speakers, please submit those in the Q&A box at any point during the webinar. I'll be keeping track of those, and at the end, I'll read questions aloud for Yong and Yunzhou to answer. If we don't get to your question, or if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us or the research team after the webinar. We are recording this webinar and we'll distribute the link broadly afterwards, so please feel free to share this with others who may not have been here and might be interested. And again, please follow up with the research team should you have any questions. And with that, I will turn it over to Yunzhou to share her screen and Yong to start the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Kayla, for the very nice introduction, and welcome everyone to our webinar. This is on, yes, great. So again, thank you for joining us. So what we're going to talk about it today is that, we want to review the work we have done in the past 2.5 years, basically. And both Yunzhou and I work at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. Yunzhou, can you, next slide, please? So today's talk, we're going to cover 4 parts. And, we will start with lay out a background and why we want to do this project. And then we're going to review what we have done, basically, we're going to review the climate vulnerability assessment methodology and how they can apply to the fisheries. And we're going to assess socioecological vulnerability and the risk of China's fisheries using a database approach. And also we're going to try to integrate professional or expert and local knowledge to address issues that we counted in climate vulnerability analysis. Into next slide. So the first part, why we want to do this work. And as you all know, that China is the largest producer and export of marine fish and fishery product. And it basically accounted, based on really the most recent FAO report in 2024, accounted for 14.3% of global marine capture fishery production. And socioeconomically is also extremely important. Fisheries in China, employing approximately 17 million people in the industry. And but of course, like a lot of other places in the world, that China also face a lot of issues with the declining stocks because of overfishing, habitat loss, marine pollution, and other anthropogenic activities along the coast. Roughly, in China, based on the analysis in the past, about 57% of fish stock are overexploited or collapsed. And a lot of a catch basically consists of a small, low value and short-lived, low trophic level species. Next slide, please. So it faces a lot of a challenge in domestic fisheries management in China. So why get there? So if you look at the paper that published by one of my former students quite a few years ago, basically Chinese fisheries management actually experienced 4 time period, prior to 1980s, and the fishery management mainly focused on try to expand fishing fleet and try to increase fishing production with a very limited consideration of conservation. And after 1980s, and realized that it is important to have conservation, in the management and make sure that they don't overfishing the population. There's a whole bunch of management measures and the policy developed, try to balance production and the conservation, and eventually to more recent, since 2016. And this conservation actually is highlighted in fisheries management. So there's a different time period, and but now that it is important that the conservation measure actually is highlighted. Next slide. So realizing that, and since 2007, there's a lot of new initiatives in China try to make fisheries more sustainable. And so there is a National Ecological Civilization Initiative since 2007, and there's a kind of a new measures implemented try to protect the marine ecosystem and restoration of capture fisheries since 2016. And in a newest 5-year plan, that is from 2021 to 2025, and there's a call for fisheries transferred from the input control to an integrated management scheme, including both input and output control. And there is a call for enhanced fishing port-based monitoring and management. And there's also a call for a lot of other implementations of a lot of other conservation measures, including protecting habitat and summer moratorium and stock enhancement, marine ranching. All those are different approaches that try to protect fishery resources and ecosystem. Next slide. And but of course, we have to do this is a lot of moving pieces in the ecosystem right now, especially climate change. That will affect the ecosystem greatly along in the Chinese domestic fisheries. There's a lot of calls for try to look at the impact of a climate change on the marine ecosystem and on the environment, but a very slow progress in the fisheries sector in China. Next slide. But a lot of evidence show that the climate change has already started to impact fisheries by in fact affecting its environment. You see that there's on the right side, on the left side of this panel, and you're going to see a huge increase in the thermal habitat along the coast, and from the on the right side, you see that a lot of the coastal storm events getting more frequent, and there's a lot of impact on the ecosystem. Next slide. And if we look at the fish populations, there's a lot of decadal variabilities in the catch, especially on the small pelagic fish species. Because I think that would mainly contribute to the climate regime shift. There are a lot of examples there. I'm not going to go to details there, but next slide. And based on some recent paper, there's a potential fish habitat range shift under future climate change. Of course, there's a winner, there's a losers, and for different species. But you look at this one and look at this projection map here, and a lot of species are going to lose their favorable habitat along the coast of China. Next slide. So realizing this potential, this impact, not potential, it's an impact, and the potential larger impact, and coming. And we have to ask a lot of questions, So one is what is the potential risk in China fisheries in the face of climate change? What are the most vulnerable species, regions, and fisheries? What are the strengths and weakness in the fisheries system to cope with the climate crisis? And what strategies should be prioritized to improve fisheries adaptation and reduce the risk? So those are 4 questions we try to address in this project. Next slide. And of course, to address those questions, there's a lot of barriers. And I think Yunzhou is going to talk a little bit more about this, but we run an expert survey, and the expert identify a lot of topics, a lot of gaps, and a lot of knowledge that we missed. And so this is a very consistent with the questions that we try to address, and understand all those questions that can address all those the gap that expert identify. Next slide. So with this project, and we hope that will increase the climate awareness and concerns in China's fisheries management, and we want to improve the connections between the scientific evidence and fishery management policy. And the project objectives, main objectives here, is advance the understanding and awareness of climate vulnerability and risk in China's fisheries to the effect of climate change, and to incorporate best available information, particularly multiple knowledge sources, to identify key factors that make fisheries vulnerable and resistant, and identify potential pathways to build climate-ready fisheries and informed decision-making. And the project has an advisory committee from both the US and China, and the advisory committee members give us a lot of feedback and very constructive comments that help really helpful for this project. Next slide. So again, we talked, the 4 topics we're going to cover, and this is 3 approaches that we're going to use. One is a global review. There's one national analysis, and then we have a stakeholder engagement. And I think Yunzhou is going to provide a lot of details on all those topics. Yunzhou, I think it will be your turn now. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. How about that? Okay.
Yeah, good.
Great. Yeah, so thanks, Yang. So before diving into 3 tasks of this project, I want to give you all a very brief introduction about climate vulnerability assessments in case some of you are not very familiar with this tool. So simply put, vulnerability is a concept that characterizes the state of system to climate change, comprising 3 components: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And this is actually a very popular and trendy tool, has been applied in many different fields like terrestrial, ecosystem, ocean, food system, and livelihoods. And it is really helpful to inform management, especially adaptation actions, as it can provide some answers about what species, habitats, or communities might be more vulnerable and should be prioritized in adaptation. What will be the inherent characteristics or biological traits of species could affect the vulnerability of the system. And more importantly, it can provide, some very straightforward answers to adaptation in terms of what could be the potential and targeted actions to reduce the risk. And now we are talking about the CVA in marine fisheries. This is actually a relatively new in fisheries compared to stock assessment and other tools developed over the last few decades. The first application of CVA to marine fisheries was initially in 2009. And as of 2021, there have been 65 case studies being developed that look at the vulnerability of marine fisheries to climate change. So you can see within this really short period of time, there has been exponential increase of CVA study number over the years. And for fisheries, there are also like different dimensions of application. There was a part of study that were focused on the ecological vulnerability, basically to understand how is the fish species and stocks are doing in face of climate change. And on the right, there's also a human dimension to look at, the vulnerability of fishing communities, especially those who are highly dependent on fisheries. And in the middle, there are also emergent practices that begin to consider the interactions between ecological and socioeconomic components of fishery. And so today, as Yang just mentioned, as a first part of this project, we did not jump into Chinese fishery. As many of you know, like China is not the first country developing CVA, and there have been so many case studies being developed over the world. So with the first step, we want to take a step back and say, what are the key lessons learned from the global practices, and especially for our case study, and how to make sure we can produce reliable and actionable outputs so that the policymaker will really utilize these outputs. So last year, we have this collaborative work with colleagues in Stony Brook University, Yunzhou and Chen, and also Christine Kleisner from EDF and Kathy Mills from GMI. We did a global synthesis of climate vulnerability assessments on marine fishery. And we asked 3 key questions. Specifically, what are the available approaches out there for people to develop CVA to address various social ecological contexts of fishery? And we were also curious about the spatial scale. What is the geographical hotspots? What is the spatial gaps over there? And also, we are very interested about the utilize of knowledge and information, especially, China's fisheries is defined as like a data limited fishery. And we want to see what are the options out there if we don't have traditional scientific data, and how we can complement with, additional knowledge and other information sources. So with that, we identified 65 case studies I just mentioned in 2021 across the globe using the PRISMA approach. And here you can see we have really representative samples of case studies from both global north and global south. And for each case study, we specifically evaluate which component of fishery were assessed, what is the framework indicators we used, spatial scale, types of knowledge information, and also we want to examine their patterns and their interactions and gaps. So for the framework, As I just mentioned, we mainly consider 3 types of frameworks and methods in CVA: ecological, socioeconomic, and sociological. And this is a little bit surprising result to us because we see that most of, like more than half of the CVA applications and methods have been mainly focused on the socioeconomic component, which is to identifying the vulnerability of fishing communities, whereas the ecological component is the least studied. And also we see there is a strong tendency over the recent years to developing and applying interdisciplinary approaches to address the dynamics between the fish species and fishing communities. And down below, we also compiled this table to categorize all the frameworks and methods into the definition, whether it's based on the original version of the vulnerability, the newer version, or others, and their dimension to help the future users to find the suitable methods and framework depending on their goal and their interest on a specific component of fishery system. And here you can also see that as of now, the majority of frameworks and methods in fisheries CVA still using the original version of IPCC framework. And also we see there are some other frameworks that are beyond the concept of IPCC. And many of them have been applied in data limited context using more of like qualitative approaches, having this bottom approach to examine fishermen's perceptions and their knowledge about the vulnerability and changes of fishery environment. And we also compile a really comprehensive and exhaustive list of CVA indicators. We identified more than 200 indicators that have been really applied and adopted in those case studies around the world. And we categorize them into 4 groups: ecological sensitivity, ecological recovery potential, socioeconomic sensitivity, and socioeconomic adaptive capacity. So here, the blue bar represents a number of indicators in each of the category, and then the orange represents the frequency in use. So basically, you can see socioeconomic adaptive capacity is the most well understood and studied across all the 4 domains, while the ecological recovery potential is the least understood. And below, we also compile this 3-tier classification system for all the indicators involved for fisheries CVA. Basically, we regroup the individual indicators based on the common themes, building upon some existing theories about sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And one thing I want to highlight is that the socioeconomic adaptive capacity, some of you might be familiar with this concept from Sinner that defines adaptive capacity into 5 domains. So what we did here is like take a further step and enrich their theory by providing the technical details to allow people use these indicators to measure and quantify the capacity of the fishing communities and societies to climate change. So yeah, there are a lot of uses and opportunities to broaden the application of these indicators identified here. And in terms of spatial scale, we find that fisheries CVA have been applied at a variety of scales from small to large. But as you can see, more than half of them are still mainly focused on a relatively small scale, like subnational, like fishing community, or provincial or state. And we also map out the geographical distribution of the CVA hotspots on a global level. So here you can see the darker color represents the country with more research input in CVA science. So US and Australia are the 2 top countries with the top research input in CVA. However, you see there are some other countries, especially in tropical country, in Asia Pacific, Africa, and surprisingly, Europe are like having less input on and research on CVA for fishery. And on the right, we come up with another map of global ranking of vulnerability based on 3 global level assessments of national fisheries to climate change. So here, the dark color, the red color, represents the color, the country with a higher vulnerability score, therefore meaning they probably require more adaptation needs than others. So if we compare these two maps, you will easily find there is a substantial mismatch between the research input for CVA and the adaptation needs, especially in tropical countries. And then when it comes to the use of information, so here we mainly consider 3 types of knowledge: traditional scientific data such as species distribution that have been used in CVA to understand exposure of species to climate change, and also local and expert knowledge, and hybrid, which means the studies can use both of the knowledge types in their study. And this is a little bit counterintuitive finding to us, as there have been a lot of papers and policy documents arguing that a lot of sustainable science doesn't include local and indigenous knowledge. But in our case, in the CVA for fisheries, we actually find local and expert knowledge is the main source for the input of CV research, especially in developing and data limited countries. And also we see there is a trend of using a hybrid of knowledge types and having this knowledge co-production to compile and to collect the different sources of information. So knowledge co-production is also a relatively new concept in sustainable science. And this refers to a collaborative process of including diverse partners and actors in this decision-making process to build up the knowledge. And this kind of process has a lot of merits, such as closing up the knowledge gaps. It can also has a potential to increase uptake of information to address complex social problems. However, in our review, we do see there are some problems and barriers in terms of engagement in fishery CVA. And one is that the purpose of engagement or collecting professional and local knowledge was not clearly defined. And also there lacks the understanding about what is the utility of scientific data and local knowledge in this process, and how do they complement to each other to complete the big picture and understanding about climate vulnerability. So now let's put all these 3 components on the same table to look at the patterns across the scale and their interactions. So basically in this figure, you can see there are a lot of interactions between them. And we find, if you want to do CVA at any of the scale, you basically can find existing frameworks or approaches for ecological or socioeconomic component of fishery, which is represented there, the strength of the quartz here with the blue. However, if you want to conduct more interdisciplinary research like sociological vulnerability, you will see that most of the exercises are being focused on a relatively small scale, like subnational scale. And similarly for like knowledge co-production using a hybrid of knowledge and information, you will also see most of exercises are happening at a relatively small scale, and that also requires like another step to scale up this process and to make sure the regional problem or national problems can also be addressed through this kind of beneficial process. So here we summarize all the key lessons learned from the global practices. Methods-wise, we see there are diverse approaches being developed over the last few years, and we also see there is a trend on socioeconomic component and on a small scale. There's also a growing interest in applying sociological approaches to understand vulnerability. There have been methods developed for data limited regions. However, one thing that was a little bit different from our assumption when we started this project is that we see this is kind of like a trade-off for us to choose the right methods and framework, because on one hand, we want to have a standard protocols so that we can compare case study to the other and know what are the differences and whether we can transfer knowledge to improve fisheries adaptation. And on the other side, we also see this value of valuing, the local realities and make sure the methods and indicators are contextualized so that some unique characteristics of fishery can be reflected in the CVA. So that's a really important lesson for us to learn from the review. And in terms of scale, we see there have been a lot of methods applied at various scale, but at the same time, there's a significant issue about mismatch of scale and also the mismatch between the research and the management needs. And lastly, I think this review sends a really enlightening message, which is that the stakeholder engagement is widely happening in the CVA science. However, we noticed there is still a lack of guidelines for people to have this high quality engagement and knowledge production. There have been a lot of concerns about the data quality collected from this engagement, and also this kind of lack of goals and purpose will easily lead people to have the fatigue to be involved in this kind of projects in the longer term. So with these lessons in mind, we gonna move to the next part of this project, which is to use a data-based approach to evaluate social ecological vulnerability and risk of China's marine capture fisheries to climate change. And this is also a collaborative paper we recently published this year. And the objectives of this work is to inform management by identifying the most sensitive and vulnerable species in the regions. And we want to identify key factors influencing vulnerability and the possible areas for improving adaptation. We took a portfolio of approaches, including literature review. We also developed databases of biological traits of species and the social economic data. This study also involved spatial exploit analysis, evaluating policy documents, and indicator-based assessment. As I just mentioned, we use a lot of information from the indicator inventory from the global review. And for the scope of this work, we focused on the domestic marine capture fisheries. And we included 3 marine ecoregions, Bohai Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and South China Sea. And this study also included 28 taxonomic groups and 37 species. This was actually a very tricky process for us to identify and select the species, because some of you might know that the landing data in Chinese fishery are very taxonomically coarse. So that means we have to take a process like to consult with the species database and our experts to identify the most representative species and also the species that are inhabiting and caught in Chinese water. And also for the socioeconomic analysis, we covered 11 coastal regions from Liaoning province and Hainan province. So now I'm going to walk you through the framework of this work from like a bigger picture perspective. So there are 3 components in this framework. We started from evaluating climate hazards by analyzing the spatial data of climate projection, of temperature, salinity, pH, dissolved oxygen, and chlorophyll in 50 years. And then we conducted a spatial analysis to determine how likely the species will be exposed to these potential changes in environment. And the exposure was determined by 2 factors. One was the species distribution within the 3 marine ecoregions I just mentioned. And the other, we also look at the historical records of biological responses to each of the climate hazards to see what will be the affecting hazards to species biological processes. And at the same time, we also come up with this database of species vulnerability comprising their sensitivity and the recovery potential. And then with this information, we have the ecological risk. And then this risk was like serves as a connector between the ecological and socioeconomic component of this study. So we treat ecological risk as the fishery hazard to the coastal region. Basically, you can think of this as like the potential changes might affect the livelihoods or food security of the coastal region. And similarly, we determine the social exposure by their catch diversity and catch composition of the coastal region. And similarly, we develop the database of social vulnerability and finally have the score of the social ecological risk of the fisheries. So this is a very quick snapshot of all the indicators we involve for species vulnerability. As you can see, we utilize some universally applied indicators identified from the global review, such as pre-specificity, population growth, etc. We also created and included some novel indicators that are unique to China's fisheries. For example, we look at the number of MPA targeting specific fish species as the objective. And also we look at the temporal overlap between species spawning seasons and some moratorium, as this is, some moratorium has been the world's largest fishery closure, and this is also the most strictly enforced management measure in China. So we want to measure whether there is any recovery potential benefits received from the species from this management measure. And also look at the stock enhancement to see whether there is any genetic influence on natural population from enhancement. And similarly, these are the indicators for social vulnerability. We look at fishery dependence, economic dependence, food dependence, and particularly here we look at the possibility of aquaculture to diversify food sources and to reduce the burden from the marine capture fisheries. And we look at infrastructure sustainability, governance, such as monitoring, the number of TC pilot fishery, and also the policy support on climate adaptation, learning assets, social organization, and the flexibility of fishing fleets. So in the interest of the time of this webinar, I'm going to just focus on 4 takeaway messages from this part of work. So first takeaway, we find there is a variation in species responses to climate change. There is a lot of information in this figure, and today I want to focus on these 2 quadrants, the green one and the red one. So the species in the red quadrant means they are more sensitive and have lower recovery potential, meaning they tend to be more vulnerable than others. Whereas the species here on the green box means they are doing well. So if you look at the landing volume of each of the species, which is the size of circle, and you can see most of the high landing, high yielding species seem to be doing well, and they are on the green box. This is actually a very interesting finding, resonates with another project funded by Landfast. So the Cao et al. Paper finds that the China's steady fishery production is primarily supported by a limited number of highly productive fish species. So what we find in this project is that those species that have managed to survive the stress of overfishing also has this remarkable ability to cope with climate change. And there are a lot of reasons. For example, they have pretty resilient biological traits. They tend to draw more conservation attention and fewer management interventions. And I'm going to talk more about this in the next few slides. So we learned that the high landing species are doing well. What about high risk species? Here we come up with this ranking of ecological risk from high to low. And this number represents the order of taxon's landing percentage. So you can easily see that on the top of list, most of species contribute a very small proportion to total landings. However, it doesn't mean they don't matter in face of climate change. Actually, they hold significant cultural, ecological, and socioeconomic importance to fishing communities. For example, large yellow croaker, this is known as a national fish for its high economic and cultural values for the coastal region. And sand lance, this is a forage fish, not only important for China, but also for Korea and Japan fishery. So this also sounds like important international implication about how to monitor and manage transboundary species in face of climate change. So since we know there are some species that are more vulnerable and less vulnerable, and what about the key factors contributing to their risk? Here we have this heat map showing the magnitude of exposed hazards, sensitivity, and recovery potential of 28 taxa. So you will see like the darker color means they have higher value, like higher hazards exposed, higher sensitivity, and higher recovery potential. So from this map, from this figure, we identify several major factors contributing to vulnerability, which are the temperature, early life stages sensitivity, stock status. Many species also have very narrow thermal tolerance. Also, they are pretty sensitive to acidification. And for recovery potential, we see most of species are doing well in reproduction, but many have very limited larval dispersal capacity. We also look at the data qualities by species and by different indicator, which is shown by the gray boxes mean there is no information available for the indicator. And there are some substantial data gaps in early life stages, in stock status, and also a majority of the responses to climate hazards are focused on the catch, landing data, or distribution, but there is fewer understanding about physiology, phenology, and ecosystem interactions to other environmental variables. So that was the ecological component of the CVA study. And now if you're more like a socioeconomic person, this is your party. And here we also find these regional variations in coastal region in terms of their capacity and sensitivity to climate change. So here you can see the southeast part of China, they have higher sensitivity mainly because of their high reliance on fisheries. For example, they have higher landing weight, landing value, employment. They are more traditional full-time fishers. There are more vessel number and higher economic dependence than other regions. And as I just mentioned, when we talk about indicator, there are a lot of opportunity to use this indicator, maybe like translate some of the outputs into management recommendation. So here we also identify some possible area to improve adaptation and reduce sensitivity. For example, diversify employment opportunities, build resilient small-scale fisheries for the regions that have more traditional fishers, and diversify seafood production portfolios to reduce the burden on capture fishery. And similarly, you also look at the adaptive capacity by region. So obviously, the regions that have higher sensitivity are doing well in terms of adaptive capacity. But we also see the region near the Bohai Sea and Hainan province have lower adaptive capacity, mainly due to their monitoring efforts, research input, fishermen's income, the involvement of social organization, and their fleet diversity. Okay, so some of you might also notice there are some consistently high or consistently low score for sensitivity or adaptive capacity. So we think that also suggests there are some common challenges over the country, such as the high reliance on fish protein, low capacity for monitoring, and there's overall limited involvement of non-governmental actors in decision making. And we also look at the policies, especially the provincial 5-year plan on ocean management and fisheries management, to look at whether there are any mentioning of the critical governance attributes for climate resistant fishery, and those attributes were derived from Mason et al. Paper. So you will see there are some alerts on several attributes that are missing in the management plan. For example, adaptive decision making, information sharing, equitable and inclusive governance, participation in decision making, and also monitoring and evaluation. So with the previous slides, I think this information sends a strong message that if we want to improve fisheries adaptation in Chinese fishery, we not only need localized and bottom approach to address this local reality and the unique challenges in coastal region, we also need a more holistic thinking and top-down strategic approaches to address some institutional barriers we find here. For the last part of this project, we take a further step to look into additional knowledge and information beyond the scientific data we just collected. And there are also a lot of papers and policies have been advocating the use of all forms of information and knowledge. But one question that was really discussed is how to optionalize that, and also what is the strength and weaknesses in different types of knowledge, and how we can better synergize the use of knowledge system to facilitate their uptake in decision making. I'm going to talk about expert surveys we did last year over the country, and we recruited 33 participants from 3 regions, and they cover different career stage, also from very diverse expertise from natural and social backgrounds. The objective of this survey is to understand experts' perceptions, very general perceptions about climate change impacts on fishery, and also we want to learn their thoughts about species vulnerability and socioeconomic vulnerability to climate change. And lastly, we want to build upon the data-based approach and see what might be the knowledge gaps between different knowledge types and compare and contrast the results from different approaches. So I'm going to talk about the taxon vulnerability identified from those experts. So step 1, we asked experts to score taxon vulnerability to climate change, and also ask them to rate their confidence level. And then we have this final score of experts' judgment about the taxon vulnerability from high to low. And the third step, we compare and contrast the score from data-based approach and expert knowledge. So you will see there are very different perceptions on particular groups. We did some cluster analysis here, and you see there are like 4 clusters. There are some groups, experts and the data-based approach have some agreements. But what is really concerning is that people and data have a lot of disagreement on the vulnerability of small pelagic fish and low landing species. And that is really concerning because when it comes to decision making, it's really important to make sure the information we have is not biased or have too many uncertainty. And so here we want to understand why we have so different results in terms of taxon ranking. The first perspective we look at is the measuring indicator and criteria. So these are the indicators we used in the data-based approach, with the blue boxes meaning the major factors identified from data-based approach, and the gray box means the factors with unavailable information. And then we overlay the dots, which represent the major factors used by experts for their judgment. And you will see there is a substantial mismatch in terms of indicator use. While most of the experts, they care more about population growth, habitat environment, and stock status. However, we do see there are some, few people use early life stages or, larval dispersal as the judgment criteria. And also, if we look at the color of the dots, which represent the criteria they used for scoring, you also see there is some disagreement. Like some people will think, a faster growth is more resilient, or it's not, it's on the opposite. So you will see there are disagreement about the definition of vulnerability. And that also implies the importance of technical guidance to make sure people are on the same page and people are aware of the best practice about how to score a species vulnerability. And the second perspective we look at is the information use for judgment. On the left, we ask those experts, what is the information you use for the scoring? And as you can expect, that many experts, one of the merits of using expert knowledge is that they have a lot of personal observation experience, and they also have the capacity to compile different knowledge sources like scientific research reports, monitoring data. However, we see there is a gap in using social knowledge data, or people are not very familiar with the technical guideline, and they also have little interactions with fishermen to incorporate fishermen knowledge into their scoring. And then on the right, we ask them another question, like, what if we have a second chance? What will be the additional information you would like to have to support and improve your judgment? And you see there is a very interesting story here, especially for those they think they are lacking. People think it will be also important for them to make the judgment. And lastly, we look at the confidence level of experts and data quality, because there's no perfect information out there, and there's always a bias with professional knowledge and uncertainty with data. So we want to compare and see how we can better synergize different knowledge types. And here we can also see a similar pattern as I was showing in the previous slides. There are some, consistent information gaps from expert knowledge and data quality, which are both relatively low. And also there are some opportunities for different knowledge types to complement to each other, especially for species that have a more confidence level from experts, but low level of data quality and vice versa. And also on the top right, we see there are some species that there are more data quality, they're better quality, and also the confidence level is higher. And that suggests some opportunity to evaluating and validating the knowledge and information in the future. So with that, we compiled this table to summarize the strength and weakness of different information and the knowledge types. We are still working on this, and in the process of this drafting this paper. So stay tuned on that. But the most important take-home message from this work is that we find there is a unique value in each of the knowledge types. And it's also important to include diverse actors and resource users to make sure the science and knowledge produced are reliable and usable, so that decision maker can come up with actionable and representative solutions from this. So the next steps, we are currently working with a lot of partners in the US and China to further the operationalization of climate resilient fishery. And we are also working to apply some of our methods and results into regional case studies in US and China. And we really hope, at the end of this project to come up with a series of recommendations and strategies to support fisheries management reforms in China, and also to inform, the management adaptation in other places, especially people with similar challenges as we see, like data limitations, and there are a lot of complex social and ecological interactions in the fishery system. So with that, I really appreciate everyone's time and attention to join this meeting. And if you guys have any question and want to talk more about this project, we'll be happy to connect, and feel free to contact us through the email below. I'm gonna stop here.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for that wonderful presentation. There's certainly a breadth of results that are coming from this project that have lots of implications for management decisions moving forward, I think even beyond China as well. So thank you very much for sharing that. We do have one question in the chat that I'd like to share. And if anyone else has questions, please submit them in the Q&A box, and we'll probably be able to get to one or two of them before the end of the webinar. So the first question, what is the sampling method of the survey? The participants are designed to have more from university or more from biology? Thank you.
Yeah, so we took like a stratified sampling approach for the survey. So we have like two tiers of stratified. So first, we want to make sure the three regions will cover. So we have the Bohan Yellow Sea, East China Sea, and the South China Sea. And for each of the region, we want to make sure that all the sectors like university, the management agencies and NGOs are covered. So we want to make sure like all different partners, sectors were included in this survey. But I think what we returned from the survey is like the real situation in Chinese academia and the fish research. Well, where the biology and ecology still dominates in the dynamics and community of science. But we also have a lot of really interesting socioeconomic perspective from the survey. I think it's also very interesting, and we didn't include the socioeconomic vulnerability assessments in this project, but this is definitely something we're gonna deliver in the paper, and so stay tuned on that. We'll be also happy to share that once that is out.
Fantastic. Yeah, and we'll be providing links to all of these papers and the resources that we shared in the chat as well. And when the new paper comes out, we'll be sure to share it with this project distribution list. Next question, how will these changes and impacts affect China's distant water fishing? I'm particularly interested in China's State Council white paper on DWF that came out in October 2023.
Well, I think I try to. This is not a part of this project, but we do work with Shanghai Ocean University. I think probably I don't know whether there's anybody on the audience from Shanghai Ocean University. They are in charge of scientific research that relate to the distant water fishing fleet in China. And again, this one is not I'd be happy to talk to. I think Steve Jackson. I think I'd be happy to talk with you, privately instead of this, because it's not related to this topic.
Perfect. Sounds great. I think we've answered all the questions in the Q&A, and it looks like we're finishing just on time. So we'll go ahead and wrap up. I want to thank again Yong and Yunzhou for joining us. And please do follow up with the research team or us at LenFest. Should you have any more questions, we're happy to engage with you further. And yeah, with that, have a great day, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.